Imagine it's March 3rd, 1961. You are a 24-year-old rice farmer's son living in a small village outside Daegu, South Korea. Your house has a dirt floor and a thatched roof made of straw. You own one ox, half an acre of land, and a single change of clothes for winter. Most nights, your family eats barley mixed with whatever rice you can spare because rice alone is too expensive to eat every day. You've never seen a paved road in your life. The radio in the village belongs to the only family rich enough to own one, and 20 people crowd around it just to hear the news. If you have ever wondered how a country can go from being one of the poorest places on earth to one of the richest in a single human lifetime, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a documented pattern. It happened in one specific country in one specific generation, and the numbers behind it are almost impossible to believe. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never learn in school. Now here is where it gets interesting. That young farmer's son was living in a nation that, in 1960, had a gross domestic product per capita of about $79 a year. Let that number sit for a second. $79, not per month, per year. That made South Korea poorer than Ghana, poorer than Sudan, and roughly on par with some of the most impoverished nations in Africa at the time. North Korea, its neighbor across the border, was actually richer than the South in 1960. Most of the country had just crawled out of a brutal civil war that ended in 1953, a war that flattened cities, destroyed farmland, and killed millions. There was almost no industry. There was almost no infrastructure. There was, by most measures, almost no hope. And yet, within about 30 years, this same country became one of the wealthiest, most technologically advanced nations on the planet. This video is about how that happened. Not through luck. Not through some hidden natural resource nobody else had. South Korea has almost no oil, almost no valuable minerals, and very little farmland. What it had instead was a method, a repeatable, almost mechanical process for turning a poor agricultural society into an industrial superpower in roughly one generation. And once you understand that method, you start seeing it, or the lack of it, everywhere else in the world. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Most people think national wealth comes from resources in the ground, or from luck, or from colonial history. But the South Korean case proves something different. Wealth, on a national scale, behaves a lot like a fire. You cannot just throw a match on wet wood and expect flames. You need dry kindling first, then small sticks, then bigger logs, added in the right order at the right time. Throw the big logs on too early before the kindling catches and the fire dies. This is the secret key to the entire story. South Korea's government, under a leader named Park Chung-hee, who took power in a military coup in 1961, did not try to build a wealthy consumer economy first. They built the kindling first. They forced the nation to save money instead of spend it. They forced factories to sell their goods to foreigners instead of to their own poor citizens, because foreigners actually had money to spend. And they funneled nearly every available dollar into a small number of industries that could grow fast and sell to the entire world. It was harsh. It was controlled almost like a military operation. But it worked, and it worked at a speed that economists still study today. This brings us directly to the first major piece of evidence, and it is one of the strangest origin stories in modern industrial history. In the mid-1960s, the Park government decided that South Korea needed its own steel industry. Steel is the backbone of almost everything industrial: the ships, the cars, the buildings, the machines that build other machines. Without steel, you're always buying it from someone else, at someone else's price. But South Korea had no money to build a steel mill. The World Bank looked at the country's economic plan and refused to lend the money, calling the idea unrealistic for a nation this poor. So the government turned to an unlikely source. Under a 1965 treaty, normalizing relations with Japan, which had colonized Korea for 35 years until 1945, Japan agreed to pay reparations, payments meant to compensate for the damage and exploitation of the colonial period. A former Army Major General named Park Tae-jun was given an almost impossible task. Take this reparations money and build a world-class steel mill from nothing on a stretch of empty beach near the city of Pohang. Construction began in 1970. Workers built the plant on land that had been little more than sand and fishing huts a few years earlier. Park Tae-jun reportedly told his engineers that this project was being paid for with the blood and suffering of their ancestors under Japanese rule, and that failure would be an insult to that history. The pressure was intense, almost spiritual in weight. The first molten iron poured out of the furnace in 1973. The company was called Pohang Iron and Steel Company. Today, the world knows it as POSCO, and it grew into one of the largest steel producers on the planet. Steel output that had been around 326,000 tons in the early 1960s exploded to over 6 million tons by 1970 and kept climbing for decades after that. Now think about what this meant for an ordinary person. A young welder in Pohang in 1973 might have grown up, like our farmer's son from the opening, eating barley because rice was too expensive. Suddenly, that same young man could get a stable factory job, a uniform, a paycheck that came every month instead of depending on whether the rice harvest survived a flood. The steel mill did not just produce steel, it produced an entirely new category of person, the industrial wage worker, someone whose income was no longer tied to the unpredictable mood of the weather. This is the part most people miss when they study economic growth. It is not just about national statistics rising on a chart somewhere in a government office. It is about millions of individual lives quietly shifting from subsistence farming, meaning growing just enough food to survive, into a cash economy, where a regular paycheck replaces the gamble of agriculture. That shift, multiplied across an entire generation, is what an economic miracle actually feels like from the inside. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. If a country has almost no natural resources, no oil, no gold mines, no diamonds, where does real wealth actually come from? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear, and it changes how you see every poor country on the news today. This leads to the second part of this story, and it involves cars instead of steel. In 1967, a businessman named Chung Ju-young, who had already built a construction company called Hyundai, decided to move into automobile manufacturing. At the time, this seemed almost absurd. South Korea had no car industry, no trained engineers in this field, and no domestic market large enough to justify it, since almost nobody in the country could afford a car. Hyundai's first attempt, a car called the Cortina, built with British technology under license, was a flop. It broke down constantly on Korea's rough, unpaved roads. Most companies would have quit after that kind of failure. Hyundai instead decided that the real problem was dependence. They were renting someone else's technology instead of owning their own. So in 1974, they unveiled the Pony, the first mass-produced car designed and engineered substantially by Koreans themselves, using an Italian designer for the body but Korean engineering underneath. It was not a great car by global standards, but it was theirs. This matters because of a mechanism economists call export-led growth, which simply means a country gets rich by selling things to other richer countries rather than waiting for its own poor citizens to build up enough money to buy things domestically. Picture two villages. In one village, everyone is poor, and they only sell vegetables to each other. No matter how hard they work, the total amount of money circulating never grows much, because nobody outside the village is putting new money in. In the second village, people work just as hard, but they load their vegetables onto a truck and sell them in the wealthy city nearby. Now new money is flowing in from outside, money that did not exist in the village before. That new money gets spent locally, paying workers, buying tools, building shops. The second village gets rich. The first village stays poor, no matter how hard anyone works. South Korea, under Park Chung-hee's 5-year economic plans starting in the early 1960s, deliberately built the second village. They forced their companies to compete on the export market, selling to America, to Europe, to anyone who would buy, because that brought genuinely new wealth into the country instead of just shuffling existing poverty around in circles. By the late 1970s, Hyundai was exporting cars to countries across the developing world. By the 1980s, the company was selling cars directly into the United States. The Hyundai Excel, launched in the American market in 1986, became one of the best-selling import cars in U.S. history during its first year. A stunning achievement for a company that, less than 20 years earlier, had been welding together a car that fell apart on bad roads. Ordinary Koreans who worked on those assembly lines went from being farmhands or unemployed laborers to skilled factory workers with rising wages, often within the span of a single decade. Annual economic growth during these decades frequently hit double digits year after year, a pace almost unheard of in peacetime history. Now observe what this case has in common with the steel story. In both cases, the government identified an industry, steel, then automobiles, that the country had no business attempting given its poverty level. In both cases, private companies were pushed, sometimes with government pressure, sometimes with cheap loans and tax breaks, to attempt it anyway, aiming the product not at poor domestic buyers, but at wealthy foreign markets. And in both cases, ordinary workers experienced the same transformation, moving from unstable subsistence income into stable, rising wage income within a single working lifetime. The mechanism repeats, only the industry changes. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, and it deserves a third example, because this one reveals something the first two cases hide. Steel and cars required heavy machinery and government-connected conglomerates called chaebols, family-controlled business empires like Hyundai and Samsung that grew enormous with state support. But South Korea's growth was not only about giant companies, it was also about a deliberate, almost obsessive investment in education, starting from a refocus that began as early as 1954 and accelerated through the 1960s and 1970s. The government and ordinary families alike treated education as the one investment poverty could not destroy. Even families with almost no money would sacrifice nearly everything to keep their children in school longer, because a literate, numerate workforce was the raw material every other part of the plan depended on. Think about the steel mill in Pohang or the Hyundai assembly line in Ulsan. Neither one works with illiterate workers who cannot read a blueprint or operate precision machinery. South Korea's literacy rate, which had been low under Japanese colonial rule and then devastated further by the Korean War, climbed dramatically through the 1960s and 1970s as the government made primary education nearly universal and pushed hard into secondary and technical education. By the time POSCO and Hyundai needed thousands of trained engineers, machinists, and technicians, the schools had already quietly produced them. This is the part of the South Korean story that rarely makes it into the news because it has no dramatic factory or famous brand name attached to it. But without it, the factories and steel mills would have had impressive buildings and no one qualified to run them. A factory without skilled labor is just an empty shell, beautiful from the outside but hollow inside, like a grand house built with no rooms finished. This is also where Park Tae-jun's story connects back to something deeper than just steel. After building POSCO, he went on to found POSTEC, a research university focused on science and engineering, explicitly because he believed Korea's long-term competitiveness depended on producing its own scientists rather than forever importing foreign expertise. The pattern holds. Build the heavy industry, yes, but also build the minds that will eventually run it, improve it, and replace the foreign consultants who were needed in the early years. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people still believe that economic miracles are about luck or natural resources or some mysterious cultural trait that cannot be replicated. If you are still here, you're not most people. Hit subscribe, because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part where the pattern gets tested by disaster, and we see what it was actually built to survive. Now look at all three cases together, the steel mill, the car company, and the education system, and the same mechanism becomes visible underneath all of them. A poor country, choosing a small number of strategic industries and an educated workforce to support them, then forcing those industries to sell their output into the wealthiest markets on earth, rather than relying on their own poor population to buy domestically. Different industries, different companies, different decades within the same broader period, same underlying mechanism every time. Economists sometimes call this a developmental state, meaning a government that treats rapid industrialization almost like a wartime mission, directing capital, protecting young industries from foreign competition until they are strong enough to compete, and demanding results in exchange for support. It is not a free market in the textbook sense. It is closer to a guided market, where the government picks the direction and private companies provide the speed. But here is where history gets uncomfortable, because this kind of miracle was never free of cost, and it did not protect everyone equally. The same 5-year plans that built Pohang's steel mills also kept wages deliberately low for factory workers throughout the 1960s and 1970s to keep Korean exports cheap and competitive on the world market. Farmers, meanwhile, were often squeezed by price controls on their crops, controls designed to keep food cheap for the growing urban workforce, even as those same farmers watched their own incomes stagnate. The standard of living for city laborers and rural farmers improved much more slowly than the dazzling headline growth number suggested. The miracle was real, but it was not gentle, and it was not evenly distributed while it was happening. Political dissent was crushed under an authoritarian government that lasted until the late 1980s. The economic transformation and the expansion of political freedom did not arrive together. They arrived decades apart. And then in 1997, the entire system was tested in a way nobody had predicted, and this is where the story turns genuinely dark for a moment. On July the 2nd, 1997, Thailand abandoned its fixed exchange rate, the system that had kept its currency, the baht, pegged at a stable value against the US dollar. The baht collapsed. Panic spread across Asia like a wildfire jumping from one dry hillside to the next, because investors who had poured money into the entire region suddenly feared every economy there was equally fragile. By late 1997, that fear reached South Korea. Foreign investors who had lent enormous amounts of short-term money to Korean banks and the giant chaebol conglomerates suddenly demanded their money back, all at once. South Korea's foreign currency reserves, the dollars the country kept on hand to pay its international debts, collapsed to under $20 billion by some estimates, against roughly $150 to $170 billion in total foreign debt. The country was, in financial terms, about to run out of cash to pay what it owed to the rest of the world. Imagine being a 45-year-old factory manager in Seoul in November 1997, someone who had spent his entire career riding the miracle upward. who owned an apartment, had 2 children in good schools, and believed, like most of his generation, that the growth would simply continue forever. Within weeks, his company began mass layoffs. The Korean won, the national currency, lost nearly half its value against the dollar in a matter of months. Interest rates, under conditions imposed by the International Monetary Fund as part of an emergency bailout finalized in late 1997, rocketed from around 6% before the crisis to as high as 23% in January 1998, an interest rate so high it strangled ordinary businesses overnight, the financial equivalent of trying to breathe through a straw that keeps getting narrower. This is what economists call a sudden stop, when foreign money that had been flowing freely into a country abruptly reverses and flees all at once, like a tide that does not recede gradually but simply vanishes in a single afternoon. The IMF bailout itself, one of the largest in history at the time, came attached to harsh conditions, demanding the restructuring of corporate debt and reform of the labor market, conditions that meant mass layoffs were not a side effect of the crisis, but practically a requirement of the rescue. This is where the human cost becomes specific and personal. Middle-class families who had finally, after a generation of struggle, achieved some comfort, found themselves watching that comfort evaporate within a single winter. Small business owners who had borrowed in dollars to expand suddenly owed nearly twice as much in won terms once the currency collapsed. Workers in their 40s and 50s, the very generation that had built the steel mills and the car factories with their own hands, often found themselves unemployable in an economy now obsessed with efficiency and layoffs. Meanwhile, the giant chaebol conglomerates that had taken the riskiest loans and arguably caused much of the crisis through reckless overexpansion largely survived, restructured with government and IMF support, while ordinary households absorbed much of the actual pain. And yet, what happened next is one of the most remarkable civic responses in modern economic history, and it deserves to be remembered alongside the original miracle itself. Beginning in November 1997 and accelerating into January 1998, a grassroots movement spread across South Korea called the Gold Collecting Campaign. Ordinary citizens, moved by a sense of national emergency, began voluntarily bringing their personal gold to collection points, wedding rings, children's birth rings, even Olympic medals and military honors, to be melted down and sold abroad to help pay off the foreign debt. One respected religious leader, a cardinal, donated the gold cross he had received at his ordination. War veterans gave up medals that represented some of the most meaningful moments of their lives. Within about 4 months, roughly 3.5 million people, something like 1 in every 4 households in the country, participated. Together, they donated approximately 227 tons of gold, worth around $2.1 to $2.2 billion at the time. The question is not whether economic shocks like this repeat throughout history. They clearly do, in country after country, decade after decade. The only question is whether ordinary people understand the pattern well enough to recognize it before it arrives at their own doorstep. If this channel helps you think differently about how economies actually move beneath the headlines, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change how you see the next crisis before it happens. Now, to be precise about the numbers, because precision matters here, that gold covered only around 10% of the IMF's bailout amount. It did not single-handedly save the country, in a financial sense, but the psychological effect was enormous. It signaled to international markets and to the Koreans themselves an extraordinary level of collective resolve, a society choosing shared sacrifice over national default. Combined with brutal corporate restructuring, painful layoffs, and the eventual stabilization of the currency, South Korea did something almost no other country hit by the 1997 crisis managed to do. It repaid its entire IMF loan 3 years ahead of schedule, finishing in August 2001, years before the original deadline. Interest rates, which had spiked to 23% at the worst of the panic, fell back down to around 5.25%. By January 1999, evidence that the financial bleeding had genuinely stopped. The historical record shows that those who came through this period, both the companies and the individual families, largely shared a few key characteristics. First, low dependence on short-term foreign debt, meaning families and businesses that had not borrowed heavily in dollars against assets priced in the rapidly weakening won were far less exposed when the currency collapsed. A debt taken out in a foreign currency does not stay the same size when your own currency loses half its value. It effectively doubles in real terms overnight, the financial equivalent of a flood, rising not gradually but in a single sudden surge that catches you while you're still asleep. Second, diversified and flexible skills, since workers in the most specialized single-purpose roles within bloated chaebol divisions were hit hardest by the layoffs, while those with transferable technical skills, the same kind of broad education the country had invested in decades earlier, found it easier to move into new roles or new companies as the economy reorganized. Third, and this is something almost no one expects to hear, a willingness to accept short-term pain for long-term stability. The households that survived this period intact were rarely the ones looking for someone to bail them out personally. They were the ones who cut spending early, adjusted expectations quickly, and treated the crisis as a fact to be managed rather than a nightmare to be denied. This is not financial advice. It is simply what the historical record of this specific period shows about who came through it with their footing intact. Let's go back now to that 24-year-old farmer's son from the opening of this video, standing in his dirt-floored house outside Daegu in 1961. If he lived an ordinary working life, he would have been in his 30s during the explosive growth of the 1970s, possibly working in a steel mill, a shipyard, or a car factory, watching his own children grow up with shoes, with electricity, with an education his own parents could never have imagined affording. He would have been approaching 60 by the time the 1997 crisis hit, perhaps watching his own son or daughter face layoffs in a system far more sophisticated and, in some ways, far more fragile than the one he had helped build with his hands. That single lifetime, from a dirt floor and barley rice to a global economic crisis and a citizen-funded gold campaign to repay an international debt, contains almost the entire arc of modern economic history, compressed into about 40 years. Most countries take centuries to move through transformations like this. South Korea did it inside one human generation. And then, when crisis struck, it showed the world something equally rare, a society's willingness to absorb collective pain rather than collapse. The lesson underneath all of it is not really about South Korea specifically. It is about how national wealth is actually built and how quickly it can be tested. It is built through patient, often harsh, often unequal investment in a small number of strategic industries and in human capital, meaning the skills and education of ordinary people, sustained over a generation, aimed outward at the wealthiest markets in the world, rather than inward at a population too poor to buy much of anything. And it is tested, eventually, by shocks that arrive from far outside any single country's control, shocks that reveal which parts of the miracle were built on solid ground and which parts were built on borrowed time. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual and national situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision based on patterns discussed in this video. This video is not for everyone. Most people will scroll past stories like this, looking for something faster, something with less history attached. But if one person in your life has ever asked why some countries stay poor while others transform within a single lifetime, share this with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change how they see the next 40 years of their own life. Subscribe for more deep dives into the patterns history keeps repeating, and I will see you in the next one.